Welcome to this online skill class, Analysing Language Samples at the Emerging Stage of Language. This is part 1 and part 2 will be in a separate slide. So in part 1 we're going to talk about profile measures, particularly MLU and to a smaller extent TTR. MLU stands for mean length of utterance, TTR stands for type token ratio, and these are referred to as profile measures because you end up after the analysis with a profile number, and it indicates whether a child is progressing, developing as expected or not. You don't end up with anything further than a number. It's nothing descriptive. So that's the point of part 2. So as a welcome and a warm-up, our focus today, and a lot on this week for the case, will be on language at the 2-word stage and beyond. We're still looking at children early on in their language development trajectory, but we are looking at least when children start to join words, so beyond 1-word stage. This clip here, which I thought was really delightful, can serve to remind you about the broad stages of language development. So pause now if you want to watch it, otherwise keep viewing. So in this online class we will discuss the profile measures, particularly MLU, which is a measure of grammatical complexity. We will talk about semantic measures of vocabulary diversity, type token ratio, as I mentioned, which is a combination of numbers of different words and number of total words. I'll go through all of that shortly. In the second part, we'll talk about descriptive grammatical analyses for preschoolers or people using language at the preschool age. We'll look at morphological analysis and syntactic inventory. So let's just consider what a language profile measure is. It simply profiles the child's linguistic capacity in a particular domain, and our focus is going to be on morphology and syntax, using a quantifiable, essentially a numeric measure. They're not descriptive, they just give you a number, and from that number you will interpret whether the child's language in that domain is progressing as expected. So mean length of utterance, which you may see as MLU, sometimes referred to as MLU small m for morpheme, is defined as a measure of grammatical length and complexity of the expressive language that the child uses, and simply determines the mean length of utterance that the child is using in morphemes. Type token ratio, which we're not going to focus on, mainly because it's not used that widely anymore, but I'd like you to know about it, is a profile measure of vocabulary diversity. So it's measuring the semantics, an aspect of semantics as opposed to grammar. It's a calculation combined of the number of different words in the sample divided by the number of total words in the sample. Now, there are steps to calculate that which I'm not going to ask you to do. I just don't think you'll be doing it very much in your clinical work. But just for reference, you count the numbers of different words, not worrying about the morphological endings in a sample. So if the child has the word cat appearing and cats appearing, it's not counted as a different word. Essentially, you do that calculation. If anyone would like more information, please feel free to contact me. When you do that calculation, you just need to get a number over 0.5 or 0.5 and over to indicate the diversity is okay. I'll leave it there, but if anyone wants more information, I'm happy to provide that. I'd like the rest of this to focus on the grammatical profile measure of MLU. So, it is a profile measure of structural linguistic proficiency, and as we know, we want children's utterance length to increase once they get beyond the first words, a single word stage. So, to complete an MLU calculation, this is what you will need. You yourself will need an intimate knowledge about typical language developmental patterns of the language. Typically it will be English for this course, but you may be working in other languages as well. You need to have knowledge about the structural aspects of a language. In particular, you need to have a language sample so that you can examine the structural aspects. You need to have a language sample where you've written utterances transcribed verbatim but line by line. You need to have knowledge about morphemes, morpheme types, morphological and syntactic development, and in your language sample you will need a minimum of 50 utterances. You may have already viewed the online clips talking about morphology, and talking about transcribing language samples. If you need to go back and review those, they are going to be there for you for the rest of this semester. A language sample the importance cannot be underestimated. Clearly, it's going to be our data source, so we want to collect a language sample that is as representative as possible for your child or the client. So you might need to collect a couple of language samples. You might even ask parents to record an interaction, a play sample at home. There are many different ways that you can do language sampling, but the important thing is that you're confident that gives a representative display of what the child is capable of doing in their oral language expression. So here are the guidelines, the key questions. Do I need to record the sample? Probably as novice speech pathologists, yes. With more experience, if the child's MLU is 3 or lower, typically at ages 2 to 3, maybe 2.5 to 3, you might be able to transcribe online as the child is talking, particularly if the child is talking to someone else. Certainly if the MLU is, you think it's going to be over 3, you may need to record the sample, and in fact I'd recommend that just as a verification method as well. How long should it be? We've known for a long time that you need a minimum of 50 complete and intelligible utterances. Then if they're not intelligible, there might be a word or a whole utterance that's not intelligible. We can't count morphemes. So complete and intelligible utterances is really important. So you need 50 of those. It might mean that your sample is quite a lot longer than 50 utterances produced by the child. I typically don't count yes and no's for obvious reasons. They don't really tell us anything about a child's morphological abilities. And I try and avoid one word or single word answers. Again, we're trying to elicit extended utterances as much as the child can do. What should you discuss in the language sample? Again, your creativity is allowed to flourish here, but as a standard rule, we try and immerse ourselves into our client's world to minimise the number of closed questions and also to foster a situation where the child is most likely to give us a lot of information. So again, some general guidelines. These are not fixed, but under 3.5, our samples will usually be with the child in free play. Over 3.5, free play is absolutely fine as well, but we can still now start getting some personal narratives. So child can talk to you a little bit more about themselves and what they do or what's at home and so forth. Beyond 4, play is always going to be useful and personal narratives, but we can also start extending the types of sampling we might elicit, like story generation, story retelling, and conversation, even via an interview, such as, pretend I am your mum. What would you like to ask me? Once again, creativity and taking the child's particular characteristics will help you as well. So back to what you need. I've highlighted here now looking at morpheme types and your knowledge of morphology and syntax. So we need that knowledge because MLU itself is a gross index or a general index of expressive language, so that it can quickly identify the linguistic stage of the child. It can identify if the child requires further evaluation, but it is not sufficient as a standalone diagnostic tool. Now, by that it means it's almost like a screening tool. So you might take a language sample, calculate an MLU, determine whether the language stage reflects the child's chronological age, and then if it doesn't meet, if there's a discrepancy and the MLU is lower, significantly lower than the child's chronological age, that is an indication that more detailed, descriptive testing and perhaps formal testing is warranted. Your MLU calculation will result as a number, and you will match that number to some stages that we'll look at shortly. Now, to calculate MLU, it's a simple formula. It's the number of morphemes in the sample divided by the number of utterances in the sample to give you MLU. Calculating number of morphemes is straightforward. Calculating number of utterances is straightforward. Calculating the number of morphemes is where we're going to spend our time in the next few slides, making sure that we get it right. As brief background, to the genesis of MLU, we need to go back to Roger Brown and his famous study in 1973. I'm confident that you all would have heard and or read about this study, but I'll just recap some of the key points. He described 5 stages of linguistic development based on his own study, where he tracked the mean length of children's utterances in a longitudinal study. Now, that's a really strong design. The only weakness is that there were only 3 children in his study. Nevertheless, it has formed the basis for MLU and the various calculations. The essential finding from his study was that the order of acquisition of morphemes was similar for all 3 children. So from that, he concluded that linguistic complexity of language developed in a predictable set of stages, and it could be reflected in MLU and looking at stages of language development. So in effect, MLU is a better predictor of a child's language than saying their age, and his study has formed the basis and ongoing remains the way that we explain language acquisition. Despite the fact that it's considered flawed in terms of the sample size, the accuracy of his descriptions remains accepted. So we'll look at those descriptions in the next few slides. Here are his stages. That little dictionary at the top is just to indicate that this is for your reference. So take some time just to look at these stages, ages and stages. I'll just point out a few things, but this can be referenced when you're actually doing an MLU calculation. So in the first column, we've got stages 1 to 5, and then beyond beyond stage 5. In typically developing children, we move beyond stage 5 when children have an MLU of over 4.5. MLU is not worth calculating. It's not going to tell you anything meaningful once children's MLU is well beyond 4.5. So in the second column, I've got MLU, and that's bolded, and the range unbolded. So that tells us how many morphemes should be in what the MLU is, so how many morphemes per utterance on average. And the third column links it to the age that those children typically use that MLU. So at stage 2, the MLU is about 2.25, and typically children at 28 to 36 months have an MLU or in the stage 2 range. So 2.25 on average with a range of 2 to 2.5. In the fourth column, we've got descriptions of how the language structures might be that reflect an MLU of the length, and some examples in the fifth column. So again, there's a lot of information there. Please just save this as a reference for when you're doing calculations, and tables like this are in many books as well. So why and how we compute our MLU? We compute it because it's used widely clinically and in research. It's easy for using in retest purposes. You don't have to wait any time in between doing the calculation. In contrast, if you did a formal standardised test, you typically wait at least 6 months to a year before you can retest. So MLU calculations can literally be done every single session. It's stable and predicts the rate of growth in language production in the preschool years, as per Roger Brown's study, and it provides you an in or an opportunity to start appraising language. So it's a really good screening tool that helps you determine whether a child needs further evaluation or it appears that their expressive language is on track. So the how is you need to segment your language sample into utterances. We've talked about how 50 is really the lower limit that's recommended. You just have to do an orthographic transcription. You don't need to do a phonetic transcription. Put each utterance on a new line, and that's simply just going to help you with the mechanics of calculating the MLU. Eliminate any utterances that have any component that is unintelligible, and then you'll do the counting, and then that's shown on the next slide or two. So this is what we count as one morpheme. Any free morpheme and any bound morpheme. So if the word was cat in the utterance, that's 1. If the word in the utterance was cats, that's 2 morphemes, because you count 1 for the free morpheme, the word, and 1 for the bound morpheme, the plural s. Auxiliary verbs are counted as 1, whether they're contracted or not, and all modals, auxiliaries and catentatives are counted as 1. Those words like have to, wanna, gonna, they're just used so much in conversational output, even though we don't write like that. Irregular past tense forms are counted as one. I went, I ate, I saw, and there are plenty others. We don't credit that as two because these don't have the ed form. We also count irregular plurals as one. Proper names, and children will often refer to characters and proper names like Dora the Explorer, bananas in pajamas, and so forth. So just count them as one because to the child it's one chunk of information. Compound words are counted as one morpheme. Reduplications or words with diminutive endings, which is very typical in young children's expressive language output. Self-corrections, don't count the false start, count the final version. So in the example we have here, the, no, the table. You sometimes have to make a judgment call there, but essentially the, no is helping the child just get started. And similarly, stuttering or false starts just count the primary word once. So we went, we're just going to count the word we as one morpheme, not three. These are the ones that can be a little bit tricky to be aware of and maybe seem a little bit not as intuitive as the others, but this is the rules that we need to follow if we're going to use the ages and stages chart from the previous slide. Count as two morphemes. If a child overgeneralises the past tense form, so if he or she says, I goed to kinder, we count that as the verb go plus the ed ending. The correct form is I went to kinder, and if that's what the child said, only one morpheme would be allotted to went. But in this case, as many children do, the child has overgeneralised the past tense form. And we also count as two morphemes a contracted verb plus the negative. So isn't is the same as is not, which would be counted as two morphemes. So again, that can be a little bit tricky because you're actually giving the child more credit than they would get if they'd actually got the verb correct. But again, they're the rules that these calculations were based on. Here are a list of things not to count. I'll give you a moment to look through all of those. I've covered many of them in the previous slide about what to count. So moving on and doing the calculation, you've transcribed the language sample and utterances are on separate lines. You've identified the utterances you will use for your MLU calculation. You will count the number of morphemes in each sample, and it's easy to do it line by line, which is why I suggest writing each utterance on a separate line. And then you do the calculation. You divide the number of morphemes by the number of utterances in the sample to give you your MLU calculation. So the calculation itself is not hard. The important part is the first bubble, counting the number of morphemes accurately. So from there you can determine what stage the child has reached based on his or her MLU and determine if that's commensurate with the child's chronological age by using that table that was a few slides ago. And then also note any comments or observations. I always have a notepad or somewhere to just scribble some other observations about the language that the child is using, just to support my overall comprehensive assessment. So here's a chance for you to have a go at separating out utterances into their morphemes and counting the morphemes. In this first example, I've given you a model. So I've counted it as I need that, which is 3 morphemes, and I'd like you to now try the next 9. These are all fairly straightforward, and we've got some more complex examples on slides to come. So pause here, and in the next slide I've got some answers. If you've got any queries, the answers will be on the next slide. Further queries, discuss with each other, and if need be, put a post on the forum. Here are the answers. Once again, you can pause and just check how your responses match up. And here's the calculation. There were 35 morphemes for 10 utterances. That's not enough to do a proper MLU, but for the sake of just having the experience, we'll assume that it's a full sample. So your calculation will be 3.5, which puts Sammy at stage 4, and you can from this interpret that MLU or utterance length in morphemes is on track with what's expected. Here are some utterances with some more complex examples. You might need to refer back to what you need to count morphemes, whether they're 1 or 2. So I'm going to just pause for a couple of minutes while you do this and then have some answers on the next slide. And here are the answers as well. Once again, if you're not sure about anything, please work with each other and post queries to the forum. MLU has its place, and we've talked about when and how it can be used. So keep in mind that it is a gross profile index only. That's all it can do. If you assess a child and find that the child's chronological age is well above their language age based on an MLU, your measure won't tell you anything specific about where the child's language has gaps, any areas that are particularly poorly developed. It will just indicate to you that there is a problem and you need to go and evaluate further. So it is an important measure, but it's certainly not a sole measure. It really can be thought of as a powerful screening tool. Watch this clip if you'd like a summary of morphemes in MLU. I notice that I've got 2 A's at the top of the slide, which I do apologise, but you can just click on the link. I'm going to briefly talk about type token ratio, and I've asterisked number of different words because that is that's probably the most important factor and the area of TTR that takes some practice. So, it's defined as a profile measure of the diversity of expressive vocabulary. It must be done using spontaneous language, not through some sort of formalised testing. Type token ratio itself compares the number of different words, or NDW, compared to the number of total words. So by definition, it can't be more than 1 because you can't have more different words in a language sample than total words. So we just want to see a TTR of 0.5 or greater as an indicator that lexical diversity, or put it another way, that the range of different words that anyone is using is sufficiently diverse. It's appropriate from children at about 2.5, once again when there's some word combinations, some short utterances being produced, but it can actually be used right through to adulthood as well. The calculation is as follows: the number of different words in the sample divided by the total number of words to give the TTR. And just again, this reinforces 0.5 means that semantic diversity is okay. I put that in quotation marks because it's a much more blunt instrument than compared to MLU, which you could see was quite graded. Here are the rules for counting different words to calculate TTR. Keep in mind here, we're interested in words, not so much on morphemes. So first block tells you what to count as one word, so free morphemes, whether they've got their bound morpheme or not. Hyphenated words are one word, stereotyped phrases are one word, and contractions of verb negative are one word. 2 words when there's contractions of subject, predicate, it's or it is, there, they are, and so forth. So you need to count the number of words, which is the easy part, total number of words in the child's sample. Identify the number of different words using these rules, keeping in mind that all the bound inflectional morphological variations do not count as a different word. So again, another example, car and cars is not a different word. because we're looking at lexical diversity here. We're not looking at morphological skill. You now have the skills to calculate both MLU and TTR. I'm confident that MLU will be very important and TTR won't be called upon that much, but you do now have all the equipment to do so. It's now a matter of practicing, and I have uploaded some practice tasks for you on LMS. So thank you very much. If you have further queries, please start by posting them to the news forum so that your queries can be seen by everybody as well.